I never thought my own daughter would tell me to leave my mother's funeral. I never imagined she'd do it with my sister smirking beside her, like I was the stain on our family name. But what they didn't know was that Mama had left one last letter. One that would turn the whole room on its head and hand me the key to everything they tried to take. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a reckoning. Comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. My name is Patricia Allison, though most folks just call me Pat. I'm 66 years old, born and raised in South Carolina, and I've spent most of my life in Greenville, in the foothills where the air smells of pine and the evenings carry the sound of cicadas. I never thought I'd live long enough to say that family, my own blood, would treat me like a stranger, but here I am. I suppose introductions matter, especially if you're about to hear the way my daughter and my sister-in-law turned on me. My daughter's name is Emily. I raised her on my own after her father walked out on us when she was little. Every penny I made as a seamstress went toward giving her a decent life, and every decision I made was about keeping a roof over her head and a chance for her to do better than me. The other person you'll hear about in this story is Marjorie, my late brother's wife. She and I were never close, but after my brother passed, I tried my best to support her. She became more involved in the family's riverfront inn, the same one my parents built from the ground up back in the 70s. The inn wasn't just a business, it was a landmark in our town, a place where travelers stopped for a meal or a night's rest, and where our family gathered on holidays. But as the years rolled on, Marjorie began treating the inn like it was hers alone, even though Mama still held the controlling shares. She kept the books locked away, always saying, "Don't worry, Pat. I'll handle the numbers." At the time, I was too busy working and caring for Mama to question her, but I should have paid more attention. Now my daughter Emily. I don't like speaking ill of her because she's my child, but honesty is the only way through this. Emily had a way of leaning on me when she needed something and pushing me aside when she didn't. When she married Scott, I thought maybe she'd finally found someone steady who would bring balance into her life. Instead, Scott turned out to be the type of man who talks big about streamlining and modernizing, but never lifts a finger himself. He saw Mama's estate not as a legacy but as a payday waiting to be cashed. By the time Mama passed, the tension in the family was thick enough to cut with scissors. I had cared for Mama through her final years. The late nights, the medications, the endless doctor visits. Emily and Marjorie stopped by here and there, but the heavy lifting? That was on me. I did it gladly because Mama wasn't just my mother, she was my anchor. And in those quiet evenings when it was just her and me, she'd often say things like, "Pat, you'll be all right when I'm gone. You've done right by me." I believed her words. I thought love and loyalty meant something. But the day of her funeral showed me just how wrong I was. I remember walking into that church in Nashville. The air was heavy with incense, and the pews were filled with family I hadn't seen in years. I expected grief, maybe even some awkwardness. What I didn't expect was the cold wall I felt the moment I stepped in. Emily was sitting up front, right next to Marjorie and Scott. They didn't wave me over, didn't even nod. It was as if I'd slipped into the service uninvited. That's when the humiliation began. The whispers, the turned heads, and the sharp sting of betrayal I'll never forget. Before I go further into what happened that day, I want you to understand the players in this story. I am a woman who worked her whole life with her hands, threading needles and hemming clothes while raising a child alone. Emily is the daughter I poured everything into, the one I sacrificed for. And Marjorie is the woman who saw me as a nuisance, someone easier to sideline than to respect. Together, they thought they could erase me from my own mother's memory. But what they didn't realize was that Mama had one last word to speak, even from beyond the grave. Before everything fell apart, life in Greenville was simple, even if it wasn't easy. I had my routines, my small comforts, and the pride of knowing I'd raised Emily on my own. I started every morning the same way. Coffee brewed strong enough to wake the dead, the newspaper spread out on the kitchen table, and the sound of the neighborhood kids walking to school. I didn't have much, but I had peace, and I thought that was enough. Emily was my greatest joy and my greatest burden all rolled into one. From the day her father left us, she became the center of my world. I worked long hours as a seamstress at a little alterations shop downtown, fixing hems, patching uniforms, and sewing wedding gowns for brides who had no idea what it cost me to make their dresses perfect. Every dollar I earned went to Emily. Ballet lessons when she was young, tutoring when she struggled in math, even a used car when she got her license. I didn't mind sacrificing. That's what mothers do. Still, there were moments, little flickers of warning, that maybe Emily wasn't learning the same lessons I was teaching. She'd roll her eyes when I reminded her of how hard I worked. She'd sigh dramatically when I asked her to help me with errands. And when she went off to college in Columbia, the calls home grew shorter and less frequent. I told myself that was normal, that kids needed distance to grow. But in truth, it felt like she was slipping away from me piece by piece. Then there was Marjorie. When my brother passed, she inherited his stake in the Riverfront Inn, and from then on she acted like the place was her kingdom. She dressed in tailored suits, clicked her heels across the inn's hardwood floors, and spoke to me like I was some distant relative rather than her late husband's sister. Mama still owned the controlling shares and I held a piece too, but Marjorie liked to keep the books locked in the cellar and brush off any questions. "Pat, you wouldn't understand the accounting," she'd say with that condescending smile. "Leave it to me." I should have fought harder for answers back then, but my energy was pulled in another direction. Mama. As her health declined, the weight of her care fell squarely on my shoulders. She had a gentle soul, Mama did, but sickness robbed her of her strength. I bathed her, cooked her meals, kept track of her medications, and sat with her through long, quiet nights when pain kept her from sleeping. Emily and Marjorie would visit here and there, but it was always brief. A casserole dropped off, a hug at the door, then excuses about busy schedules. Sometimes, late at night, Mama would look at me with tears in her eyes and say, "You're the only one who's here for me, Pat. I don't know what I'd do without you." I'd squeeze her hand and tell her she wasn't alone, that she'd never be alone as long as I was breathing. Those words bound me to her, and they gave me strength even when I was exhausted. But not everyone saw my sacrifices that way. Scott, Emily's husband, was always circling around Mama's estate like a vulture. He'd make comments at family dinners about how complicated it was to manage multiple properties. He'd talk about how smart families consolidate assets before the government takes a chunk. I could see the gleam in his eyes every time he mentioned the farmhouse or the inn. He didn't care about legacy or memories. He cared about what could be sold, split, and pocketed. Emily, under his influence, started echoing his words. "Mom, maybe it's best if Marjorie just handles everything. She knows what she's doing. We don't want to drag things out when the time comes." I'd bite my tongue, unwilling to fight with my own child, but inside my heart ached. She was starting to sound more like Scott than herself. Through it all, I clung to my bond with Mama. We had a rhythm, a quiet understanding that stretched back to my childhood. She'd sit in her chair by the window, humming hymns under her breath, while I mended clothes or folded laundry. Sometimes she'd tell me stories about her youth, about how she and Daddy scraped pennies to buy the inn. She'd remind me that family was everything, that honesty and loyalty were worth more than gold. I believed her, even when others in the family didn't live by those words. Looking back, the warning signs were all there. Emily's distance, Marjorie's secrecy, Scott's scheming. They were threads fraying at the edges of the life I thought I had stitched together. But I pushed those doubts aside, convincing myself that when the time came, Mama's love would carry me through, that her wishes would protect me. I never imagined how wrong I was. I never imagined that when Mama took her last breath, instead of unity, there would be betrayal. And I certainly never imagined that betrayal would strike me down at her very funeral. The morning of Mama's funeral in Nashville is burned into my memory like a scar. The sky was gray, the kind of heavy gray that presses down on you until even breathing feels like work. I wore a simple black dress I'd sewn myself years ago. My way of honoring Mama, who always said you didn't need money to have dignity, just care in how you carried yourself. When I stepped into the church, the smell of lilies and polished wood hit me all at once. The organ played softly, and the pews were filled with cousins, neighbors, and old friends. People I hadn't seen in years turned their heads to watch me walk in. Some smiled faintly, offering sympathy, but others gave me the kind of look you give someone you've already judged without hearing their side. Up front, in the first pew, sat Emily with Scott at her side. And there, next to them, was Marjorie, chin high, lips pursed, looking every bit the widow in charge she liked to play. Not once did any of them wave me forward, not once did they signal that there was space for me beside them. Instead, I felt their eyes sweep over me like I was an unwelcome guest at my own mother's farewell. Still, I tried to ignore the coldness and walked toward the casket. My knees felt weak as I approached, the sight of Mama lying so still nearly undoing me. I reached out, brushed my fingertips against the polished wood, and whispered a prayer under my breath. For a moment the room blurred and all I could see was Mama's face in the months before she passed, smiling at me even in her pain. That's when I felt it, Emily's presence at my side. I turned expecting a hug, some comfort. But instead she leaned close, her voice low and sharp like the slice of a knife. "Mom," she whispered, her eyes darting around, "just pay your respects quickly and go. The family needs privacy." At first I thought I'd misheard her. My own daughter, telling me to leave my mother's funeral? I stared at her, my mouth dry, waiting for her to laugh, to tell me it was some kind of cruel joke. But she didn't. She just looked back at me with cold determination, as if she were the one with authority, as if I were nothing more than a disruption. Behind her, I caught sight of Marjorie smirking. That smug, satisfied look told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just Emily acting on her own. She was being guided, influenced, molded into the kind of person who would cut out her own mother if it meant protecting someone else's grip on power. Scott stood too, his hand firm on Emily's shoulder, backing her up without a word. I could feel the heat rising in my face as people in the pews began to notice. Their whispers rolled through the church like a storm wind, the kind of murmur that feeds on humiliation. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole, because in that moment I wasn't a grieving daughter. I was a spectacle. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Finally I managed a whisper. "Emily, I'm your mother. This is my mama too." Her eyes flickered just for a second. I thought I saw doubt, maybe even guilt. But then she hardened again and shook her head. "Please, Mom, don't make a scene. Just go." My legs felt like stone as I turned away from the casket, retreating toward the side aisle. Each step echoed in my ears louder than the organ's hymn. I could feel eyes burning holes into my back, pity from some, judgment from others. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give out right there in the church. I sank into a pew in the side chapel, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling in my lap. It was the lowest I'd felt since the day my husband walked out. Grief and humiliation tangled together until I could barely tell one from the other. And that's when the unexpected happened. From the pulpit, a voice rose above the murmurs. Clear, steady, commanding. It was Thomas Green, the lawyer. He adjusted his glasses, looked over the crowd, and spoke words that silenced the entire sanctuary. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone even, "before this service concludes, I have been instructed to read a letter. It is from Mrs. Margaret Ellison, written before her passing, addressed to her family and to be shared publicly here today." The room stilled. Even the organist paused mid-note. All eyes turned toward him. I froze, my breath caught halfway in my chest. Mama had left a letter? And she wanted it read aloud here in front of everyone? Emily's head whipped around, panic flashing in her eyes. Marjorie stiffened, her smirk vanishing. And in that moment, even through the fog of grief and humiliation, I felt the first spark of something else. Hope. I stayed in that side chapel long after Thomas's voice faded back into the rhythm of the service. The chapel was small, with a narrow stained glass window that let in strips of gray light like ribbons laid across the pews. Dust floated in it, lazy and slow, as if even the air didn't want to move. I pressed my hands together to stop the trembling, but the shake was inside me, deeper than muscle. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't comfort, it presses. That was the quiet I sat in, heavy, watchful, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. Someone slipped in through the side door and closed it gently. A woman in a black blazer with a silver name tag, one of the funeral assistants, stood a few steps away, soft-eyed and cautious. "Mrs. Ellison?" she asked, her voice careful, like she was approaching a wounded animal. "I'm sorry to disturb you. We have something that was left with the director, with instructions to give it to you at the service." For a moment I couldn't make sense of her words. I wiped my eyes with the corner of a tissue and nodded, too tired to speak. She reached into the small leather satchel at her side and brought out a pouch, cream-colored fabric with tiny embroidered violets. The thread faded in places from handling and time. I knew those stitches. Mama's hands had made them when her fingers were still steady. I'd watched her years ago, sitting on the porch after supper, glasses halfway down her nose, pulling the purple thread through with that little satisfied sigh she always made when the needle behaved. The assistant set the pouch beside me on the pew as if it might break. "She told the director this was for you. Said you'd know what to do. I'm very sorry for your loss," she added and slipped back out, leaving a whisper of perfume and a deeper hush behind her. I stared at the pouch, my breath lodged high in my chest. For a few seconds I just held it, feeling the softness of the fabric, the slight weight inside. The stitches under my fingers were like a map, leading me back to evenings on the porch, cicadas buzzing, mama humming. When I finally loosened the drawstring, the scent of lavender rose up. Mama's drawer sachets, always tucked between folded linens. Two things lay inside. The first was her rosary, worn smooth at the crucifix where her thumb had passed over it 1,000 times. I cradled it in my palm and felt the cool beads steady me, the way she used to steady me with a touch to the shoulder when the world felt too loud. The second thing was a small brass key on a flat tag stamped with one word: "In cellar." My breath caught. The tag looked familiar. Rectangular, a little tarnished like the old hotel tags that hung on hooks behind the front desk. We'd had a set when I was a girl. Daddy made them himself from blank brass and a punch kit. I could almost hear the metal-on-metal ring of his hammer from the workbench in the garage. In cellar. My head swam with the words. The cellar under the old riverfront, and wasn't a dank basement the way strangers imagine. The floor was brick, the air dry and cool, always smelling faintly of lemon oil and old paper. That cellar held ledgers and boxes of deeds, the kind of records that root a family to a place. Marjorie kept it locked these last years, said it was for safety and insurance guidelines, but it was also where questions went to die. Anytime I asked about distributions or repairs or taxes, she'd smile like a hostess and say, "The records are in order, Pat. Let it be." I closed my eyes around the thought of it. The key, the tag, Mama's timing. Had she known they would try to shrink me down to nothing at her own funeral? Had she seen what I couldn't bring myself to say out loud? Mama never had a lawyer's tongue, but she could speak with actions. If she'd wanted me to have a keepsake, she would have sent me a locket, a brooch, a recipe card. Not a key. A key isn't a memory. A key is a door. I slipped the rosary into my dress pocket and kept the key in my hand, its edges biting gently into my skin, bringing me back from the fog. Across the chapel, the muted swell of the hymn rose and fell. I pictured Emily up front, chin lifted, pretending not to see the wreckage she'd made of her mother. I pictured Marjorie, spine straight, fingers folded in her lap like a queen waiting to be flattered. The humiliation flickered into something warmer, firmer. Not anger exactly, focus. I thought of the cellar's wooden door and the old iron latch that always stuck unless you lifted and pulled at the same time. I thought of the wide oak shelves, the rows of boxes labeled in Mama's hand and Daddy's block letters. Fancers lived anywhere, they lived there. I felt a shadow fall across the pew. Thomas Green stood at the aisle, his expression measured. He'd removed his glasses and was cleaning them with a square of cloth, a habit of his when he needed a second to choose his words. "Pat," he said softly, and his voice disliked disturbing the stillness as much as the assistants had. "I'm going to honor your mother's instruction at the repast." She was very clear. He hesitated, searching my face. "Are you all right?" "All right." The phrase floated between us, flimsy as tissue. I managed a nod. "I will be." His eyes dropped to my hands and he noticed the pouch, the keys glint. Something passed across his face. Recognition maybe, but he didn't ask. That's the thing about good lawyers. They hear more in what you don't say. "I'll see you at the hall," he said. "If anyone gives you trouble getting there, call me." He pressed a card into my palm, the paper thick, his phone number written in blue ink that had smudged slightly at the edge. Then he left me to the quiet again. I sat a while longer, letting the weight of what had happened settle into its true shape. There's a kind of bottom that isn't a floor but a decision. Either you stay where they've put you or you stand up and set your feet. I threaded Mama's rosary between my fingers and whispered, "All right, Mama. I hear you." When the service ended, I didn't go looking for Emily or Marjorie. I slipped out the side door and into the cool afternoon. The sky had lightened a shade, like a veil lifted one layer. I drove the rental car with both hands, steady and slow, out of the church lot and across town toward the river. Nashville shimmered with traffic and neon even in daylight, but down by the water the streets quieted. The inn sat where it always had, brick and pride and history, its white trim newly painted, the porch ferns lush and green. A private event sign hung on the front door for the repast, but I didn't head for the front. I parked in the gravel lot behind the building near the kitchen entrance, where deliveries came and staff took smoke breaks in the shadow of the dumpsters. The cellar door was around the far side beneath the porch stairs, half hidden by a row of hydrangeas. I could see as I walked, where the brick had been repointed in places and where the mortar was still original, rough and pale. I traced those lines as a child, counting my way around the foundation like it was a secret path. The door looked the same, thick wood iron strap hinges, a deadbolt drilled into the frame sometime in the last decade. My heart picked up, not with fear but with a feeling like an answer stepping into view. I closed my palm around the brass tag, slid the key into the lock and pressed my lips together to keep from whispering, "Please." The key turned. The bolt slid back with a reluctant clack. I held still, listening. Voices from the front of the inn, distant clatter from the kitchen, the hum of the big compressor that fed the walk-in. No one near. I eased the door open and breathed in the cool air of paper and lemon oil and thyme. A pull string hung just inside. I tugged it, and the single bulb flickered to life, casting a small, stubborn circle of light that made the rest of the cellar fall away to shadow. The shelves were there, the labeled boxes, the ledgers stacked with their spines to the wall, brown and blue and black years stamped in gold. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. My hands went to the labels by memory: property, deeds, titles, shares, distributions, tax. The handwriting changed as the years went on. Daddy's square print, Mama's careful cursive, then a later set of labels typed and taped on with packing tape. Marjorie's doing tidy and bloodless. I reached for the older boxes first, the ones Mama would have trusted. Halfway down the second shelf, behind a row of ledgers, was a metal cash box, the kind with a handle that folds flat. It had a small keyhole at the front. I held my breath and tried the brass key, though I knew it was for the door. It didn't fit. I set the box on the work table and scanned the shelf for a second key. None. My eyes fell to the underside of the table. Daddy's habit was to tape a spare somewhere no one looked. I crouched, ran my fingertips along the edge and felt the scratch of old tape. I peeled it back and out came a tiny silver key, dull with dust. It slid into the box and turned with a click. Inside lay a stack of documents, their edges crisp, a faint notary seal peeking from one corner like the crescent of a moon. On top was a survivorship deed, Mama's farmhouse, the legal description in precise language, my name where my breath wanted to stop. Beneath it, a transfer on death instrument, notarized, plain as daylight. And below that, a share certificate, 25% of the Riverfront Inn, issued to Patricia Ellison, signed by Mama in a hand I would recognize in 100 lifetimes. My knees softened. I pulled the chair to me and sat, laying each document flat, smoothing them with the side of my hand the way I'd smooth fabric before the first cut. The cellar seemed to steady itself around me. I took out my phone and photographed each page carefully, corners anchored by the box lid so they wouldn't curl. Then I slid the originals back into the metal box, closed it and tucked the tiny silver key back under the table, exactly where I'd found it. I didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't victory. It was air returning to my lungs. Mama had spoken in the language she trusted, paper and signatures, seals and dates, and she had put the sentence in my hands. When I stepped back into the daylight, the hydrangeas brushed my skirt, and the sky had opened just enough to show a thin stripe of blue. I locked the cellar door, slipped the brass tag into my pocket with the rosary, and walked around to the front steps where the private event sign swung gently on its chain. Let them gather. Let them whisper. Let them sharpen their polite knives. I would sit and I would listen, and when it was time, I would let Mama's words stand where mine had been trampled. And if anyone tried to move them, well, some doors once opened don't close again. The repast was already underway by the time I pulled back into the gravel lot at the inn. From the front, the building looked like nothing had changed. Flowering ferns by the porch rail, strings of white bulbs twinkling against the overcast sky, guests carrying covered dishes through the door. But I walked in with the weight of Mama's documents in my purse, and that weight changed everything. Inside, the air smelled of fried chicken and peach cobbler. The murmur of conversation floated through the hall, punctuated now and then by clinking silverware. I kept to the edges, smiling faintly when people nodded but saying little. Most of them didn't know what had happened between me, Emily, and Marjorie in the sanctuary. But word spreads fast in a family, and the sideways glances told me the whispers had already begun. I found a quiet spot near the back where I could watch the room. Emily was seated at a long table up front, Scott leaning close to her, whispering with that calculating look on his face. Marjorie stood near the punch bowl, greeting cousins like she was the matriarch, her laugh sharp enough to carry across the room. She didn't even glance my way, as though I'd already been written out of the story. What they didn't know was that the story was still being written. That night, after most of the guests had drifted home, I drove back to my friend Caroline's house. She'd been my closest confidant since high school, and she'd insisted I stay with her while I was in town. When I walked through her door with my purse hugged tight against me, she raised her eyebrows. "Lord Pat, you look like you've just stepped out of a storm," she said, setting her teacup down. "In a way I have," I told her. I set the pouch, the key, and the photographs on her kitchen table. One by one I showed her everything. The survivorship deed, the transfer on death, the share certificate. Caroline's eyes widened with each page until she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Your mama didn't leave anything to chance, did she?" "No," I said quietly, running a finger along the edge of one document. "She knew. Somehow she knew this was coming." Caroline leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Pat, you've got to be careful. If Marjorie or Emily finds out you have these before it's time, they'll try to twist it, maybe even hide it. You need to keep this close to your chest." I nodded. "That's why I came here first. I needed someone I could trust." Caroline poured us both tea, strong and dark. As I sipped, the exhaustion of the day threatened to wash me away, but beneath it pulsed a steady current of resolve. I had the proof. I had Mama's words and the law on my side. For once, I didn't need to shout or plead. All I had to do was wait. Over the next day, I moved quietly. I contacted a copy service to make certified duplicates of the documents. I scanned them to a secure drive. Each step was like laying bricks in a foundation Mama had started before me. My hands shook with every decision, not from fear but from the knowledge that this time I wasn't powerless. Meanwhile, I kept my silence around Emily and Marjorie. They moved through the house like actors certain of their lines. Emily frowning at logistics, Scott checking his phone constantly, Marjorie dictating who should sit where and who should bring what dish. They didn't suspect that beneath their very feet in the cellar they tried to keep locked, Mama had already handed me the one thing they couldn't take away: the truth. And that truth was a blade I would keep hidden until the moment it needed to be unsheathed. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to let time do its work. Because the more desperate they became, the more their own actions would betray them. For the first time in months, maybe years, I slept through the night. The days after Mama's funeral unfolded like a stage play where everyone knew their part except the audience. From the outside, the family looked united, hosting the repast, shaking hands, thanking neighbors for their condolences. But behind closed doors, cracks widened. I stayed quiet, keeping to myself in Caroline's guest room while I sorted and safeguarded every piece of paper Mama had left me. I had duplicates made, files backed up, copies tucked away in places no one would think to look. Each step gave me a calmness I hadn't felt in years. But I knew better than to show it. Around Emily and Marjorie, I kept my face neutral, my voice soft, as though I were still the woman they thought they had humiliated. Marjorie, on the other hand, grew restless. I overheard her one afternoon on the phone in the hallway, her voice sharp, the way it always got when she was cornered. "I told you we'd have access by now," she hissed, pacing by the window. "Don't you threaten me. The collateral is sound. You'll get your payment." She snapped the phone shut when she saw me coming down the stairs, her expression rearranging into a tight smile. "Just business," she said lightly, waving her hand as though it were nothing. But I caught the edge in her eyes. That same evening, I noticed Emily and Scott sitting in the kitchen, papers spread across the table. They fell silent when I entered, but not quickly enough. I saw the word contract at the top of one page and a highlighted figure. More money than Emily had ever seen in one place in her life. Scott cleared his throat. "Oh hey Pat. Just looking over some options." Emily gave a little laugh, forced and brittle. "Yeah, Mom. We're just trying to help with the estate stuff." I smiled politely and poured myself a glass of water, though inside my stomach twisted. They were moving fast, too fast, already counting the eggs before they even checked the nest. By the next morning, whispers had started. Cousin Linda mentioned to Caroline that she'd heard the inn was being refinanced, though she couldn't imagine why, since business was steady. Another relative pulled me aside, lowering his voice, and said, "You know, Pat, I heard Marjorie's name came up with the bank downtown. Something about a loan." He shook his head. "Strange timing, don't you think?" I just nodded, keeping my counsel. Meanwhile, Emily began to show the first signs of unease. At breakfast, she pushed her eggs around the plate, her shoulders stiff. Finally, she blurted out, "Mom, you're not planning to fight about the farmhouse, are you? It would just complicate things for everyone." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the way her eyes flicked towards Scott before she dared to meet mine. My heart hurt, but my voice stayed steady. "Emily, your grandmother left clear instructions. None of this is mine to twist or bend." Her face flushed and she opened her mouth, but Scott cut in with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "We all just want what's fair, Pat. No reason to drag things through the courts, right?" I excused myself before I said something I couldn't take back. The pressure wasn't just mine to feel anymore. It was theirs. You could see it in Marjorie's clipped tone, in Emily's restless glances, in Scott's constant phone calls outside on the porch. Their confidence was slipping. They wanted everything tied up neatly, quickly, quietly. But Mama had already written the ending and they were racing straight toward it. I held my silence like a shield. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I let their own secrets chase them in circles. And while they schemed, Thomas Green was preparing to read Mama's letter, publicly, in front of every last relative who had gathered for her farewell. The clock was ticking. And for the first time it wasn't ticking against me. The repast hall was buzzing with chatter when Thomas Green rose from his seat near the podium. The sound of forks on plates and low conversation died down almost immediately. His calm authority had that effect on people. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and unfolded a piece of stationery with Mama's familiar looping handwriting across the top. "I have been asked," he began, "to read a letter written by Mrs. Margaret Ellison before her passing. It was her explicit instruction that it be read here, in the presence of family and friends, without delay or omission." The room stilled. My heart pounded, the documents in my purse suddenly heavy against my side. Across the room, Marjorie shifted in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. Emily froze mid-sip of punch, eyes flicking nervously towards Scott. Thomas began to read. "My dearest family," his voice carried, steady and solemn, "if you are hearing these words, it means my time on this earth has ended. I leave you with love, but also with clarity, for families can lose their way when truth is hidden." He paused, scanning the room, then continued. "To my daughter Patricia, you gave me the gift of care when I needed it most. You carried burdens quietly and never asked for more than I could give. It is my will and my wish that you inherit my farmhouse, the place where our family roots have grown deepest. It is yours outright." A ripple went through the crowd. Heads turned toward me, some nodding with approval, others wide-eyed with surprise. Emily's face drained of color. Thomas read on. "I also confirm that Patricia remains the rightful owner of her 25% share in the Ellison Riverfront Inn. Those shares were never dissolved, never surrendered. Any document suggesting otherwise was made without my knowledge or consent. Patricia's portion stands, and she shall exercise all rights as co-owner moving forward." Gasps broke the silence. Marjorie's hand tightened around her glass so hard I thought it might shatter. Scott muttered something under his breath, his jaw set tight. But Thomas wasn't finished. "One final note. Any debts, loans, or agreements made in the name of the inn without Patricia's signature are not binding upon the estate or the business. Those who made such agreements bear sole responsibility. This is not punishment, it is fairness. To build on dishonesty is to build on sand, and I will not see our family's legacy washed away." When the last words left Thomas's mouth, the room erupted in murmurs. Some clapped softly, others shook their heads, and a few leaned in to whisper behind their hands. That was the moment I stood. My knees wobbled, but my voice did not. "Mr. Green," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected, "with your permission." He nodded. I reached into my purse and withdrew the envelope Caroline had helped me prepare. Slowly, deliberately, I walked to the podium and placed the copies of Mama's deed, the transfer on death instrument, and the share certificate on the wood for all to see. "These," I said, holding the top page high enough for the nearest rows to catch a glimpse, "are the originals Mama left for me. Found in the cellar of the inn itself. They match what she declared in her letter." A hush fell over the room. Even the clink of dishes stopped. Marjorie shot to her feet. "This is outrageous. Those documents, those don't prove anything. Patricia is twisting." Thomas raised his hand, cutting her off. Mrs. Ellison, I have already confirmed these documents. They are notarized, recorded, and entirely consistent with state filings. Your mother-in-law's intentions are undeniable. Emily stood too, her voice shaky. Mom, hey, please don't do this here. We can talk about it later, just us. I turned to face her, my voice calm but unyielding. Emily, you told me to leave my own mother's funeral. You wanted me silent, erased. But Mama made sure I would not be. Her voice lives here in ink and paper, and I will honor it. For a moment the room held its breath. Then, as if a curtain had fallen, the roles shifted. No longer was I the one standing alone in humiliation. Now it was Marjorie and Emily, cornered, exposed, their schemes unraveling under the light of truth. The farmhouse was mine. The shares were mine. And their borrowed confidence collapsed like a house built on sand. The silence after Thomas confirmed the documents was almost louder than the letter itself. People shifted in their seats, some whispering, others avoiding eye contact altogether. I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against me, pity from a few, respect from others, and shock from nearly everyone else. Then came the explosion. Marjorie slammed her glass down so hard the punch splashed onto the white tablecloth. She shot to her feet, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. This is theft, she barked, her face red and trembling. She doesn't deserve any of it. That farmhouse, those shares, they were supposed to stay in the family. The word family hung in the air like a lie too heavy to carry. I looked at her evenly, my voice steady. I am the family, Marjorie. Always was. You just decided to act like I wasn't. Her lips quivered, but before she could answer, Emily stood. Her face was pale, her hands wringing at the hem of her black dress. Mom, please, she said, her voice breaking. Don't do this. Just be reasonable. That word, reasonable, landed like a stone in my chest. Reasonable was what they'd called it when they pushed me to the sidelines. Reasonable was what they whispered when they told me to accept less, to stay quiet, to be small. I lifted my chin. Reasonable would have been letting me grieve my own mother without being humiliated in front of strangers. Reasonable would have been respecting the sacrifices I made while you looked the other way. Reasonable would have been honoring Mama's words instead of trying to bury them. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Cousin Linda folded her arms and muttered something sharp under her breath. Even Thomas shifted his stance, like the air itself had tilted in my favor. Scott stood now, his jaw clenched, his arm draped protectively around Emily's shoulders. This isn't the time or the place, he said. We can settle this in court if we have to. Thomas's voice cut through his. Mr. Whitaker, I assure you, there is no court that would dispute these documents. They are binding, final, and already recorded in state records. Any attempt to sell, transfer, or encumber the farmhouse or in without Patricia's consent would be null and void. And frankly, he adjusted his glasses, any loans taken without her signature could leave your wife's aunt personally liable. Gasps traveled through the hall. All eyes snapped to Marjorie. Her face went white, then flushed crimson as whispers swept across the tables. You see, I said softly, not gloating, just speaking the truth. Mama didn't just leave me property. She left me protection. She knew what you were planning before I even dared to admit it to myself. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. She pulled away from Scott, taking a step toward me. I didn't mean to hurt you, Mom. But I thought we could keep things simple. I thought you'd understand. My heart twisted, but I held firm. Understand? You told me to leave my mother's funeral, Emily. You sided with Marjorie and Scott over your own mother. There's no misunderstanding in that. That was a choice. Her tears spilled then, streaking down her cheeks, but I didn't move toward her. Not yet. The wound was still too raw, the betrayal too fresh. Marjorie, meanwhile, sat heavily back in her chair, her hands shaking as she reached for her glass. The room had shifted against her, the power she once wielded dissolving in the wake of Mama's words. For the first time since the day Mama passed, I felt the air lighten in my chest. I wasn't erased. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the stain on the family name. I was exactly what Mama said I was, her daughter, her caregiver, her heir. The reckoning had begun, and the ones who tried to silence me were now the ones with no words left to stand on. The repast broke apart slowly like a storm clearing. Some relatives came over to pat my shoulder, whispering words of comfort. Others avoided me, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. But the ones I focused on were the three sitting in front of me. Marjorie with her lips pressed thin, Scott scowling like a man denied a prize, and Emily with tears still streaking her cheeks. I took a deep breath, letting Mama's rosary press into my palm from inside my pocket. Then I spoke not just to them but to the whole room. I don't want more fights. I don't want more secrets. Mama left her wishes plain and clear. From here on we will live by them. Not by rumor, not by backroom deals, not by greed. Marjorie scoffed, but her voice lacked the fire it once had. And what do you expect me to do, Patricia? Just roll over? Hand it all to you on a silver platter? I met her gaze. No. I expect you to honor the truth. You will work with me as a co-owner, not above me. And as for that loan you took, I let the words hang a moment, watching her face blanch. You will undo it. Every cent. You signed it alone, and you will carry the responsibility alone. Whispers filled the room again. Marjorie opened her mouth to argue, then shut it just as quickly. She knew she was cornered. Then I turned to Emily. My voice softened, though it still carried weight. Emily, you are my daughter. Nothing can change that. But you hurt me in ways I never thought possible. You cast me out of my own mother's funeral. You chose Scott's whispers over my love. And you stood by while Marjorie treated me like I was invisible. That can't be undone with tears. Emily's chin trembled. I know, Mom. I made a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to send a birthday card, I said, my tone firm but not cruel. What you did was a choice. And choices have consequences. Her eyes dropped, shame pulling her shoulders inward. Scott shifted as if to intervene, but I held up my hand. This isn't about you, Scott. This is between me and my daughter. He sank back, his jaw tight. I continued, my voice gentler now. Emily, I'm willing to leave a door open for you. But it comes with conditions. If you want a place in my life, you'll have to respect me. You'll have to stop letting others speak for you. And you'll have to earn back my trust one step at a time. No more secrets. No more pushing me aside. Emily nodded, tears spilling again. I'll try, Mom. I swear I'll try. Good, I said quietly. But understand, this time it will be on my terms. The room was silent. Cousins and neighbors who had been pretending to eat now stared openly, their forks idle. For years I'd been the quiet one, the caregiver, the peacemaker. Now for the first time I spoke not just as Mama's daughter, but as a woman who finally knew her worth. Marjorie looked away, her hands clutching the edge of the table. Emily wept softly into a napkin. Scott sulked in silence. And I felt a strange peace settle in me. Not the peace of reconciliation, not yet, but the peace of boundaries drawn and dignity reclaimed. Mama used to say, love without honesty isn't love at all. It's control. I finally understood what she meant. And I finally had the strength to choose honesty, even if it hurt. The weeks that followed moved slower than I expected, like the world itself was giving me space to breathe again. Back in Greenville, the farmhouse felt different with Mama gone. Quieter, yes, but not empty. The roses she'd planted along the porch rail were budding, their first signs of spring pushing through, and every time I watered them, I felt her presence near. I settled into the house gradually, unpacking one box at a time, arranging the furniture the way Mama had liked it. Some nights, I'd sit in her old rocker by the window, the rosary warm in my hand, and whisper thanks for the strength she'd left me with. It wasn't just the documents or the deeds. It was the courage to stand even when standing meant standing alone. Marjorie eventually signed the paperwork to unwind her reckless loan. Thomas oversaw it all, making sure every corner was squared away. She avoided me when she could, her pride too wounded for real conversation, but I didn't chase her. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, not when the foundation is too cracked. Emily reached out a few weeks later. She came without Scott, her eyes red, her voice small. I just want to talk, Mom, she said, standing on the porch like a child again. I let her in. We sat at Mama's kitchen table, the same table where Emily had once colored with crayons while I mended clothes. She apologized. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to show she understood the gravity of what she had done. I told her the door was open, but trust would take time. It wasn't forgiveness in full, but it was a step, and sometimes that's all you can give. As for the inn, it was no longer Marjorie's to guard like a dragon hoarding treasure. With Thomas's help, I hired a proper accountant and began reviewing the books for the first time in years. Seeing the records laid out clearly without secrets felt like fresh air filling a house that had been locked up too long. My 25% share gave me a voice, and I intended to use it wisely, not for revenge but for responsibility. Life didn't suddenly become easy. Grief lingered, as it always does, curling at the edges of quiet moments. But it was a clean grief now, unpolluted by humiliation or betrayal. I could miss Mama without the bitterness of being cast out. I could honor her memory by living in truth, not shadows. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun set over the rolling hills, I thought back to the day Emily told me to leave the funeral. The shame, the sting, the sense of being erased. It all came rushing back. But now, instead of breaking me, the memory felt like a line drawn in the sand, the moment I finally chose to stand in my own dignity. Mama's words echoed in my heart. Love without honesty isn't love, it's control. I knew now that she had given me more than property. She had given me the right to stand in the truth, to protect my place in this family, and to never again be silenced. So when people ask me what happened after Mama passed, I don't tell them about the shouting or the tears. I tell them this: I found my strength in the very moment they tried to take it away. And in the end, the legacy wasn't just the farmhouse or the inn. It was the dignity of knowing who I am and refusing to let anyone erase it. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.